It's a marathon, not a sprint. That is 48 hours of the most incredible science and the most incredible speakers. And we are here to spend a few moments sipping a glass of something at the end of the day. Cheers. Celebrating the speakers and to talk about what we've just seen. Now, before we talk about the STEM Day, I would like to ask everyone what they thought of the session we've just had now. Ewan, I know this is a topic close to your heart. You joined us this morning, told us what you were looking forward to. Did it all stack up this afternoon?
Definitely did. There were lots of different highlights, but for me, definitely seeing how it's impacting the clinic is really powerful. There are many places in the genome we've known that we can't really see in depth, and now we can. And there are many, many steps from, oh, I can sequence the genome with this resolution to making an impact. But some of the speakers like Dame Lynn and the UW groups have really made progress.
The Badger seat, guys. I was texting my cousin in Wisconsin saying, look, we're in the same world now. It's just great. And what about you? What was your favorite moment of the last 48 hours? What's the best bit of science you've seen?
Honestly, it's been just seeing how portable and useful like the Nanopore technology has been. So in that just recent example of seeing like using the MinION sequencing platforms like and how it can transform the clinic of taking diagnostics that would normally take like 18 to 20 days down to the space down to like the order of like 3 days to really transform how we can diagnose people in the clinic, and being able to work directly with patients is truly phenomenal. And the fact that given how portable it is, you can take it into very like sort of secluded countries. So we had the example of sending it out to New Zealand and speeding up time and doing everything in house. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, Justin's story was quite amazing, wasn't it? Being locked out of New Zealand for 6 weeks and all of the implications that had was something else. Carika, I mean, you've been on stage most of the time for the last 40 days. Have you had time to see anyone else's presentation?
I actually didn't. I was just catching up on payroll, having a company, got to pay people. So, but I was listening, and I think one of the things that stands out for me is, this technology has brought us all together from all over the world, and just hearing that everyone's so keen to share what they know and to collaborate. It's such a great atmosphere here of wanting to help each other to help people. And I think that's the biggest thing I like to take away, because some conferences, you're kind of there to compete and, it's like, oh, can I get to the really top people? Gordon is just like so humble. It's amazing. With the STEM event we had earlier, it's beautiful to see that from top to bottom, like everyone is involved and just wanting to help make a change.
Well, fantastic. Well, and you are part of that, so thank you. Carol, what's been your highlight of the last 48 hours then?
Yeah, I'm really impressed by the breadth of all of the things that Nanopore encompasses. But I really think that what really stood out to me is some of these equity issues of bringing the sequencing to places where it hasn't been before, as well as the biodiversity, these sort of broad societal areas where the Nanopore sequences is really making a difference.
Yeah. I have to say one of my favorite moments was the video of the Rwandan team who'd set up a biodiversity sequencing center in a very small container, just as she said on stage, just proving that anyone with the expectation that you need a big fancy setup is completely wrong. So we had a STEM day earlier. We had 60 students from schools all over the UK, and you guys very kindly gave us some really inspirational talks. And one of the things that we did in that session is we asked the children, and one of the teachers advised us, because last year they were very shy, asking questions. We said, how can we get through that? And they said, just make it compulsory. So we said, take some time, think about your questions and write down your questions to this panel. And they came up with some really astonishing questions, and we've got them written down here in the list. I don't know if we'll have time to go through all of them, but I wondered if I could get your thought on the question that they directed to Gordon. So they said it was for Gordon, but actually the way that Gordon answered it made it relevant for all science, and I'd love us to discuss it. So I'm going to read out the question. It said, have you got any anecdotes on risks you've taken that have paid off or not paid off? And if not, how did you recover? And Gordon spoke about risk actually just being data analysis, and the fact that you're trying something, and if it doesn't work, then that's a data point. So that's true in entrepreneurship as much as it is in science. So you weren't there, but I'm sure that's something that resonates to you in science. How do you think about taking risks in science?
It's interesting because I think when you take risks, there's these scenarios where you don't know what the answer is, and it perhaps feels like a risk, but in fact what you're doing is you're discovering. And even if the answer is not what you wanted, you've really got to walk through the doors thinking, well, if it's a no, if it's boring, if it's whatever, I've learned something. And sometimes as scientists actually we're not good at sharing the, okay, I looked at this, it's not that interesting actually, it's a little bit dull. So you do get those sorts of risks. I think many times there's also these personal risks where you have to say to yourself, I'm actually going to invest my time in doing this, so I'm going to really put myself out there and have this conversation with people. And sometimes that can be uncomfortable, and I've definitely had to talk to myself beforehand to say, okay, I know this is going to be a slightly uncomfortable conversation, but we've really got to start talking about it because we're not talking about it. So I do that around untangling genetics and race. That's an ethnicity. It's a very complicated space, as I'm sure Carika knows. Yeah. But if we don't talk about it, it just gets left unsaid. You know, these concepts are very, very different, as Carika showed. And scientifically, they couldn't be not further apart, but they are very far apart. And yet the public thought often puts them very close together. So that's an example where I've had to be comfortable realizing that not everybody in the room is going to appreciate this conversation and put myself out there. And
what are the guardrails? How do you make conversations like that safe so that people can have the conversation without stepping on landmines?
I mean,
social landmines.
Social landmines.
Yeah.
I've definitely done some of that. You learn from it. But the first thing is to be respectful and to give people space and to listen. I mean, there's the first things. They're very obvious things, but you've got to give people space, and you've got to have the conversation be two-way and not scientists teach and people absorb. It has to be a big open conversation.
Got it. But your point about mistakes will be made, Carika, that was something that you spoke about to the children today. Is that something you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, as Ewan was talking, I was like, he's just describing me over and over and over. So even with going back to the pandemic, right? So it is part of my story. But with the vaccine, you know, there was a hesitation of those who are black, right? And Bermuda is kind of like 55-40. So we have a split, and you know, initially it was like, oh, you need to take it, you need to get to 70%, you have to go, I said, no, we have to educate and let them know that it's your choice, you know, and change that conversation. And then we saw a great uptake, right? And then with this study, the question I got a lot from my staff who are non-scientists were like, what if you don't find anything? I said, well, then we found nothing. Like, then we know there's no difference, but it's still worth doing. And yes, it costs lots of money to buy, you know, all the stuff and hire people and do all of that. But at least we then know it's not genetic. But that's the worst case scenario. So why not do it, right? So it is that kind of risk trade-off. But it's like if you don't do it, then you just never know.
Yeah.
And then we're still in the dark. So yeah, failures, I've learned to embrace them and just own it. And that was something I said earlier as well. Don't try to, you know, two-step and be a politician about it. Like, just say, look, I got this wrong, but I've now recognized that and I'm moving forward. And people appreciate that authenticity as well. So yeah, I'm just super excited to be one of those people that can try to transform this space in that way.
That's fantastic. And Carol, one of the really compelling themes that you spoke to the children about earlier was when they asked you about curiosity, because we were talking to them about the fact that curiosity makes you a more successful scientist, and actually asking them to frame their questions in a way. And they asked you, well, at our age, how can we be more curious? How can we sort of manifest that in our behavior? And you spoke to them beautifully on that topic.
Yeah, it puts pressure on people when you say, well, just follow your curiosity, because then they say, well, what is my curiosity? How do I find out what it is? Mm-hmm. And understanding that you're in a situation and you're talking to people and you're interacting with everybody around you, and then curiosity emerges when you have conversations. And so I was encouraging them to, go into laboratories or put themselves into particular situations to allow their curiosity to emerge, not to assume that they have to sit in a room by themselves and come up with something curious.
I found it very interesting that you shared with the room that you didn't know at the age of 10 that you wanted to be a scientist, and that emerged throughout your sort of teenage and your 20s. Would you like to share that with us, that story? Because I found it really amazing.
Yeah, there are some people that are scientists that said, oh yeah, I had a chemistry set, when I was 7 and I sat and I did various things. And I didn't know until I was a senior in high school that I thought, what am I going to do if I go to college? And I thought biology is kind of fun. I had a very good biology teacher, which was important. And then it wasn't until I got to the university, and then I had another mentor who said, you should work in a lab. And I said, it's too early for me. And she said, no, you should work in a lab. And by being there in the environment, that's when I started to discover, oh, I am interested in this, by actually being there and doing it, not reading about it.
And that was one of the questions that really surprised me, was that they said, how much does practical work inform your career? And they really wanted to know, didn't they? Like, does the hands-on stuff that you do in the lab change the way you think about the scientific career you're going to do? And then, Jas, you and Gordon both shared quite personal stories about the expectations that your families had on you and how that informed your pursuit of science. Gordon and his family expected him to have one path, and he chose science almost as a way out of his expected path, and turned out pretty well for him. And would you like to share some of your thoughts on how your personal journey and family expectations has informed your career path?
Yeah, of course. So I was actually quite lucky. I wasn't necessarily sort of influenced by my parents so much, specifically to go down the academic route. I remember even asking them when I was younger. So in my living room, we had these photos of my sister with a degree, my brother with his degree, and there's a photo of me when I was about 10 years old. And my parents were, oh, that's not changing until you get a degree. But they weren't necessarily too fussed if I did go to university. They were more just cared about me being happy. And then when I, through my academic progression, going through like sixth form and do my A levels, the sparks were sort of there of, I kind of do want to push myself. They were very much like, you're in charge of your own life. We don't want you to, feel the pressure from us to dictate what you should be able to do, and which is quite liberating. I know it's not always the case in a lot of families from like Asian backgrounds.
Right.
For me, they sort of gave me a lot of free rein, and I just sort of took on my own journey and got to, I'm happy where it led to.
Brilliant. So inspiring. Well, I'm going to have my last question. Ewan, you've seen cohorts and cohorts of students go through this journey, EMBL-EBI. What are you seeing changing over these last years? How are attitudes to inclusiveness, progression through these careers changing? Is there more appetite for entrepreneurship in there?
So I think there is a bigger diversity of people coming into science, and that's great. And I think as scientists, we've been more reflective about trying to have a bigger space. So it doesn't matter so much your academic background, perhaps, more about whether your aptitude. And again, these areas where if you go back 20 years, they wouldn't be well represented, whether it's ethnicity or whether it's gender. Those are the two things which I've seen real change over the last 10, 20 years. But as you say, the other interesting thing is that science, you don't have to go get a PhD, become a professor, go to become through the university system. There are many, many other options. And I think the biotech and technology worlds, they're very adjacent, very fluid. I get a lot out of working with colleagues in different companies, side by side, lots of sparky ideas. And so I think that much kind of broader output as well has really helped us as a community.
That's really interesting. That's making me think, even on my time at Oxford Nanopore, 16 years and 4 months at Oxford Nanopore, and I remember when I first arrived, there was still that sort of slight distrust between academic and industrial colleagues, and that really seems to have waned. It seems like there's a much more collegiate feeling around us, problem solving together. Certainly we couldn't have improved the technology without listening to the community and working together. Do you think that's changed?
I definitely think that's changed, and it's very interesting because you might at first think that in the academic world you're doing the kind of basic fundamental research and the kind of applied is happening in the company, but very often the applied problems are actually fundamental problems.
Yeah.
and then where you apply them is often back in the lab. It transforms, just like Carol was pointing out in her talks. Transforms the way you see a very basic science problem. You're like, wow, this technology can do this. So let's go off and do it. So yeah, it's very kind of...
the membrane is more porous.
Definitely more porous.
Lots of nanopore channels going through it. Fantastic. Well, we love putting the community together at this meeting. It's absolutely delightful. We're so grateful for all of you turning up and being such sort of beacons of excitement and hope for us all. So thank you so much for your participation. There's drinks, there's cheese and wine outside. Anyone at home, get your wine out, get your cheese out, join us online, click on some of those buttons and find out a little bit more about what we were doing.